Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. The First Amendment is out of control, so says an op-ed running in the pages of the New York Times. Pretty bold editorial choice, don't you think, given how the left is always trying to say that we're the scary authoritarians. Anyway, in the article, Tim Wu, a law professor at Columbia, takes aim at the Supreme Court's two rulings on net choice this week. They both had to do with state laws in Texas and Florida, limiting the ability of social media giants to censor political speech they don't like. Wu writes, quote, while the Supreme Court remanded both cases to lower courts for further factual development, the court nonetheless went out of its way to state that the millions of algorithmic decisions made every day by social media platforms are protected by the First Amendment. It did so by blithely assuming that those algorithmic decisions are equivalent to the expressive decisions made by human editors at newspapers, end quote. He feels that the First Amendment is being stretched far beyond its original conception and therefore could limit the federal government's ability to protect national security interests and the safety and privacy of its own citizens. I wonder what his take is, though, on hate speech laws and supposed misinformation. Are those necessary to keep our sacred democracy safe from an out-of-control First Amendment? But it gets better as Wu makes the mistake that many liberals do, as our next guest tonight often explains. The idea of a liberal spurring on the revolution until it goes too far and then tramples on something they hold dear. Because Wu says it was a reasonable development, he says that positively, that the First Amendment was extended through court decisions in the 60s and 70s to protect porn and other sexual content as being free speech. Well, if that isn't the beginning of the end, then I don't know what is, because then he goes on to lament how more recent Supreme Court cases now view corporate donations as being protected under free speech, as well as the buying and tracking of online data, which I lament too. But if Hugh Hefner and Playboy can commodify human flesh and sell it back to sleazy voyeurs under the banner of free speech, then why can't other companies be granted such human rights, and put that in air quotes, to make political donations or to buy and sell online personal data? I'm not saying I like that snowball effect either. I'm very much in favor of banning porn outright, though I'm sure Mr. Wu perhaps wouldn't be. But at least I'm more honest and wanting to root out the entirety of the problem instead of just cherry picking in order to hamstring my political opponents. Joining us now to discuss is Oren McIntyre, a columnist for Blaze Media and host of the Oren McIntyre Show. Oren, thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So before getting to the merits of this article here, it is kind of hilarious, right, as you poke fun of on X, that the New York Times op-ed page decided to run with that headline, given all the censorship of conservative media going on these days.
Yeah, it's incredible that over and over again we have to go through these diatribes from Western leaders about how Vladimir Putin or Orban or some other leader is limiting free speech. They're destroying democracy. The principles of the global liberal order are being undermined. When here at home, we have to hear about how the First Amendment has gone too far. It was fine when it was like selling pornography like you were talking about. But if we have MAGA grandmas talking about who they prefer as a political candidate on Facebook, that's just a bridge too far for the New York Times when it comes to free speech.
It really is, and I guess it brings us to the main question of what is free speech. How did the founding fathers intend for it to be used? I was wondering if you could dive into some of that history for us and how we should be understanding free speech, and especially under the First Amendment.
Sure, the understanding that we have in free speech is very complicated. Of course, originally the First Amendment was not incorporated to apply to the states. It was only a restriction on the federal government itself. And so the way that we understand the Bill of Rights in general, and the First Amendment in particular, is usually wildly out of context from the way it was intended. The Bill of Rights was created by the anti-federalists who were worried about a centralized government and wanted to make sure that the federal government would not apply its dictates down to the state governments. It was not a blanket ban on any laws restricting these kind of things. So, for instance, obscenity laws or blasphemy laws were a regular feature of American life throughout most of our history. And so the understanding that we have today of the expansive First Amendment, to be fair to those making the argument in the New York Times, is very different from the one we have now. But the one thing that all of the founding fathers would have understood is that the First Amendment was there to protect political speech. That was the core interest in protecting what people could say, is that they could voice their opposition to the government, their criticism